He got trapped under a fallen tree. A grizzly bear did something no one expected. The Bitterroot National Forest lay hushed beneath a blanket of fractured trees and wind-scattered snow. In the aftermath of a storm that had torn through the region like a furious animal, the woods breathed in long silences, broken only by the occasional creak of a wounded pine. Pine needles coated the forest floor like shattered glass. Branches, some as thick as a man's arm, lay strewn in chaotic piles heavy with ice. A cruel wind still whispered through the canopy, rattling what remained. Lucas Hale moved through the broken landscape with deliberate care, his breath visible in the frigid air. Each step crunched softly, muffled by the snow that had begun falling again, gentle but persistent. He checked the slope to his left, scanned the ridge above. Every sound, distant creaks, the brushing hush of snow, triggered an instinct honed over years in the search and rescue unit. Lucas was no stranger to storms, nor to solitude. He preferred it this way. The other volunteers often came in pairs, for safety, for morale. But Lucas volunteered for the lonelier paths, the remote zones deep in the forest where no one else wanted to go. No one questioned him anymore. They knew his story, or thought they did. 6 years ago, Lucas had stood on a mountainside not unlike this one, rope in hand, harness secure, laughing as his younger brother, Ethan, climbed just ahead. They had been close. Ethan had trusted him. The kind of trust only a younger sibling could give so completely, so freely. And then the rock gave way. Lucas remembered the sudden weight on the rope, the sound of snapping. Ethan's shout, cut off too soon. He never forgot the sickening silence that followed. Since then, Lucas had buried himself in rescuing others, chasing people into danger zones, pulling them from blizzards, ravines, washed-out canyons. Every life saved felt like a stone removed from his chest. But the weight never really left. Today's storm had rolled in with little warning, a wind front that had snapped power lines, blown snow sideways, and sent half the town into shelter. It was the kind of storm that buried trails and disoriented even experienced hikers. No one was reported missing yet, but protocol demanded a check of the danger zones. Lucas was the only one who insisted on going out before morning. He told the team he'd take Zone Echo Ridge and be back by nightfall. He didn't mention the truth, that he hadn't been sleeping, that the storm brought memories clawing back, and that sometimes the forest was the only place where he could breathe. He moved cautiously around a fallen log, noting the fresh cracks along its trunk. Overhead, the trees still groaned under their own weight. Snowflakes caught in his eyelashes. He reached for his radio to call in his position when the air changed, an almost imperceptible shift in pressure, followed by a crack so loud it split the silence like a gunshot. Lucas turned instinctively, but too late. The towering tree beside him gave way, its roots wrenched from the earth, snow exploding upward as its weight came down. A sharp, splintering pain shot through his leg as the trunk struck. He cried out once, then gritted his teeth. The tree pinned his right leg beneath it, the impact so sudden his body hadn't registered the full agony yet. His heart pounded. Breathing hard, he tried to sit up, tried to pull free, but the tree was too massive. His boot was crushed, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. No, 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 he hissed, fumbling for his radio. It was half buried in the snow. He yanked it out, but the casing was shattered, wires exposed, useless. Cold was already seeping in, his fingers numbing even as he shoved them under his armpits. Blood was soaking through his pants, steaming in the cold. Snowflakes settled on his face like soft reminders of how quiet death could be. He shouted into the woods, though he knew no one would hear. The sky above had turned to iron, and light was fading fast. Time slowed. Pain throbbed in waves. He fought to stay conscious, but his body was shutting down, the cold a lullaby whispering him towards sleep. He thought of Ethan, of the way he used to whistle through his teeth when they were hiking, that same annoying tune over and over. Lucas had hated it then. He would give anything to hear it now. The snow grew heavier. The light dimmed. Somewhere in the blur of twilight and pain, something shifted in the trees. A sound, soft, heavy, deliberate. Lucas blinked, breath caught in his throat. From the tree line, a massive shape emerged. His heart leapt into his mouth. A grizzly bear. It stood maybe 20 feet away, its breath visible, its eyes fixed on him. Time stopped. Lucas didn't move. Couldn't. He stared into the bear's dark, unreadable eyes. His muscles tensed for an end he couldn't outrun. But the bear didn't charge. It didn't roar. It only stood there, watching. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. The bear took one step forward, then paused. Lucas's chest ached with the effort of holding still. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. The bear lowered its head slightly, sniffed the air, then turned. Without a sound, it disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the falling snow. Lucas lay there in stunned silence, his breath ragged. Had it really been there? Or was it a hallucination, conjured by pain and cold and regret? He didn't know. The cold dragged at him, pulled at the edges of his vision. He drifted, dreamt of the lake near their childhood home, of Ethan throwing stones, laughing, calling his name. Then, barking, sharp and clear. Lucas stirred, barely able to lift his head. A golden blur bounded through the clearing. Max, the SAR team's K9. His handler's voice followed. "We've got him!" Jessica's boots crunched into the snow behind the dog, her expression tightening as she knelt beside Lucas. "We need a splint in the med sled now." The next minutes blurred, hands digging, splinting, lifting. Someone gave him water. Someone else wrapped his coat tighter around his shoulders. Max stayed close, tail low, watching him. Lucas clutched at Jessica's sleeve. How'd you find me?" Jessica hesitated, then pulled something from her vest, a torn scrap of red cloth, part of his jacket. It was stiff with frozen blood. "Max brought it back to base," she said, her voice low. "We didn't know where he found it, so we checked his collar cam." She paused. "Lucas, you need to see this." Back at base, they gathered around a small monitor. The footage was shaky but clear. Max weaved through the trees, then he stopped. A figure appeared ahead, a large bear standing still. In its mouth, the piece of Lucas's jacket. The bear dropped it at Max's feet, then turned and walked away. Max sniffed it, then bolted. No one spoke. The room was silent except for the low hum of the heater. Jessica met Lucas's eyes, her voice nearly a whisper. "Whatever happened out there, something wanted you to live." Lucas didn't answer. He couldn't. But days later, when the snow cleared and he returned to the clearing with crutches and a bundle of cedarwood, he built a small marker by the fallen tree. 2 names carved side by side, Ethan Hale, and below it, a simple line. "Not all rescuers walk on 2 legs." He stood there in the silence of the forest, the wind moving through the trees like breath. And for the first time in years, Lucas felt something shift, something like peace. The snow had melted into a thin crust by the time Lucas stepped off the trail again, his crutches sinking lightly into the half-frozen earth with each careful step. It had been 13 days since they found him. 13 days since he'd watched a bear walk away from him carrying a torn piece of his blood-soaked jacket. And since the rescue team had come crashing through the woods with their lights, voices, and outstretched hands. His leg was still wrapped tight in a brace, a mess of pins and swelling that left him walking with a stiff, uneven gait. Doctors said he was lucky. His femur hadn't shattered, just splintered beneath the weight of the fallen tree. Still, it would be weeks before he could bear real weight again. But Lucas couldn't stay inside. Not anymore. Not after what he'd seen. People had stopped asking about the bear after a while. Most shrugged it off as the hallucination of a half-frozen man. Others gave sympathetic nods and changed the subject. Only Jessica had watched the video more than once. She hadn't said anything after showing it to him. She hadn't needed to. There was something in her eyes, recognition maybe, or just the willingness to believe what logic refused. And then, 2 nights ago, she had appeared at his door with a worn USB drive and a quiet look. "You need to see this," she had said simply, handing it to him before disappearing into the dark. He'd plugged it into his laptop, already suspecting what it might contain. Trail cam footage, time-stamped a few hours after his rescue. In the grainy black and white image, the motion sensor had caught a lumbering figure moving through the snow, limping on one leg. A bear. It crossed near the trail Max had taken, paused for a moment, just long enough to be seen, then vanished back into the trees. No time-stamped sighting followed. That had been its last recorded movement. Lucas had stared at the screen until it went dark. It had spared him. It had helped save him. And now it was gone. He didn't know why, but the absence sat in his chest like a second heartbeat. Now, with crutches and a heavy coat, Lucas had returned to that stretch of forest, not to seek explanations, but to feel it again. To stand in that place between life and death, where something wild had chosen not to be cruel. The air was still thin with winter, but the trees no longer groaned under the weight of the storm. Broken limbs had been carried away by snowplows and volunteers. What remained were scars, deep ruts in the earth, snapped trunks pointing at strange angles, and the hush of a forest still remembering what it had survived. Lucas made his way to the spot slowly, pausing often to catch his breath. The effort burned in his arms and along his spine, but it steadied his mind. Step, breathe, step again. When he reached the clearing, he stood still for a long moment, staring at the patch of flattened earth where the tree had fallen. The blood had long since faded. The bark had turned pale, almost silvered in the cold. Nothing marked the spot except memory. He pulled a bundle of cedar wood from his backpack and crouched with difficulty. The marker was simple, hand-carved and smooth. He'd worked on it every night since his release from the hospital, shaping the letters with slow care. He placed it gently into the ground near the tree's splintered base, pressing snow aside, anchoring it deep. On the front, he'd carved two names, Ethan Hale and something nameless below. Beneath them, a single line read, "Not all rescuers walk on two legs." He sat in the snow beside it for a long time, the wind curling around him like an old friend. The woods didn't answer. They never did. But something in the silence felt whole. Back in town, the story had already begun to shift. Some framed it as coincidence, others as myth. A few even joked about the ranger bear who did Lucas's job for him. But Jessica didn't laugh. She'd pulled a copy of the footage and kept it. "In case someone needs to believe," she said with a soft shrug. The others on the team had seen it, of course, but no one wanted to talk about it much. There was no explanation that fit cleanly into their training manuals or field logs. Bears didn't rescue humans, not ones bleeding in the snow. Not when easy prey presented itself on a silver platter, but the image was there, undeniable. A bear, a search dog, a bloody jacket dropped gently between them like a token in a quiet trade. Lucas didn't need the story to make sense anymore. He just needed to hold it, to carry it forward. The way he carried Ethan's memory, not as a weight, but as a fire that still burned in his chest when the world grew dark. That night, after returning home, Lucas sat by the fire with Max sleeping near his feet. He had taken to keeping the dog with him when Jessica was on other assignments. Max seemed to prefer it too, as if some part of him had also been marked by what they'd witnessed. The golden retriever would sometimes sit at the back door, staring into the trees, ears perked, as if listening for movement just beyond what the eye could see. Lucas reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. "You knew," he said softly. "Didn't you?" Max's tail gave a faint thump. Lucas smiled and leaned back in the chair, letting the firelight flicker across his bandaged leg. He thought about the bear's eyes, not wild, not tame, just ancient, as if it had seen the choice before it and made the one that left no tracks, only wonder. He thought about Ethan too, how often he'd said the forest was filled with things no one could explain, and how he used to tell stories by the campfire about creatures that watched from the trees, not to harm, but to understand. Maybe, Lucas thought, he'd been right all along. The next morning, Lucas woke before dawn. The dream still clung to him, vivid and strange. He was standing at the edge of a clearing, snow falling soft and silent. Across from him stood the bear, not threatening, just waiting. Between them lay something small and glowing, his brother's old climbing rope, coiled like a heartbeat. The bear looked at him once, then turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees with the quiet of a prayer. Lucas sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his face. He dressed and limped out onto the porch, the morning air crisp and pale blue. Max padded after him, tail wagging lazily. Together they stood in silence, watching the forest. Somewhere far off, a bird called, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the trees like a memory. Lucas didn't know what he'd seen that night. He didn't know if the bear had been real or something the forest shaped from silence and grief and cold. But it didn't matter, because in the moment when death had felt closest, something had chosen to save him. And whether that something had claws or memory or the ghost of a brother's laugh, he would never forget. He would keep walking the trails, not out of guilt, not anymore, but because some lives are saved only when someone keeps looking. And sometimes that someone walks on four legs, out of the trees, into the snow, and does the impossible. The first true thaw of spring arrived in whispers, not announcements. Meltwater slid down the bark of old pines, dripped from the tips of branches like soft applause. The forest, once brittle with ice and grief, began to breathe again. Beneath the crust of old snow, green pushed upward in defiance. Lucas Hale moved through it slowly, each step steadier than the last. His crutches were gone now, traded for a walking stick carved from fallen aspen. It wasn't graceful, not yet, but it was freedom. Each step was earned. And each one brought him closer to something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet readiness. After weeks of physical therapy, restless nights, and days haunted not by pain, but by questions that no one could answer, Lucas had made his decision. He was going back on call. Jessica hadn't argued when he told her. She'd simply raised an eyebrow and said, "You sure it's not too soon?" And he had nodded, not with the desperation he once wore like a second skin, but with calm purpose. "I need to be out there," he'd said, "not to run from it, not anymore, to be part of it again." She'd studied him for a long moment and then smiled. "I think that's the first time I've believed you meant it." So when the early morning message lit up the CAR dispatch, a missing hiker last seen near the Hollow Ridge overlook, Lucas was already strapping on his boots. The team assembled at dawn, sleepy-eyed and bundled in layers, but focused. The air was crisp, filled with that in-between scent of melting snow and new pine growth. Jessica handed out the search maps, marked in red. Group A will sweep the upper ridge. Group handles the North Basin. Lucas, take Max and follow the lower loop near the ravine trail. That path's barely stable. Watch yourself. Lucas nodded without hesitation, kneeling to clip Max's tracking collar in place. The dog leaned into the touch with quiet ease, as if sensing the return of purpose. And then they were off, boots breaking through patches of old snow, radios crackling to life like distant stars winking in and out of reach. The lower trail was silent, broken only by the occasional snap of melting ice giving way beneath Lucas's feet. Max trotted just ahead, nose twitching, tail sweeping side to side like a metronome. The landscape felt familiar, but not in a haunted way. More like a memory that had softened at the edges. Lucas walked steadily, letting the rhythm of his steps and the scent of pine pull him forward. He wasn't thinking about the bear. Not directly, but it hovered at the edges of his awareness, the way certain dreams do, half forgotten, but never far. As they moved deeper into the ravine, Max stopped suddenly, ears perked. Lucas froze. The dog sniffed the air, took 2 cautious steps, then veered off the trail. Lucas followed without question. They pushed through brambles and low brush till Max paused at a clearing half covered in shade. Lucas knelt, brushing aside the debris. A footprint, human, fresh, deep enough to suggest a limp or stagger. He radioed it in. Jessica's voice answered with a note of relief. "That's the first sign we've had. Stay on it, Lucas. We'll triangulate." Max led the way, nose to the ground, tail stiff. They crossed a shallow stream where meltwater sang over stone, then climbed a muddy slope that sent Lucas's breath catching in his throat. Still not perfect, still mending. But he didn't stop. 30 minutes later, they found her, huddled beneath an outcrop, coat torn, eyes wide and unfocused. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale. Lucas crouched slowly, voice calm. "Hey, you're okay. My name's Lucas. You're safe now." The woman blinked at him, trembling. Max eased forward and nuzzled her hand. She let out a dry sob. Lucas wrapped her in his spare jacket and radioed for medevac. As the helicopter's echo grew louder, Lucas stood back, letting the team work. He watched Max lick the woman's wrist gently, steadying her, anchoring her to the world she hadn't believed would find her. And in that moment, Lucas felt something lift from his chest. Not pain, not regret, something lighter, something like grace. Back at base, Jessica tossed him a bottle of water and leaned against the hood of the truck. "Good work out there," she said. Lucas nodded but said nothing. You're different now, she added after a moment. Quieter. He looked over. I've always been quiet. No, she said, smiling. Before, you were loud in the way people who are hurting often are. Even in your silence, you were screaming. Now, it's different. You're listening again. Lucas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sun dipped low behind the peaks, washing the trees in soft amber. Max laid beside them, tail thumping against the dirt. That night, Lucas stood on his porch, watching the wind move through the treetops. He thought about the bear again, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a truth to be held gently. There were things in this world that refused explanation. Some of them killed, some saved, some simply appeared when you needed them most, then walked away without waiting to be named. He remembered the weight of its eyes on him, the silence between them like a shared breath. In that stillness, something had passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Mercy. And perhaps that was enough. Inside, Lucas reached for his brother's old journal, the one he'd kept from their climbing trips. He hadn't opened it in years. The pages were creased and stained, filled with scribbled notes, sketches, song lyrics Ethan used to hum. Near the back, a short entry stopped him cold. Saw a bear today. Didn't run. It looked at me for a long time, not scared, not angry, just watching, like it was asking if I belonged here. Lucas stared at the page for a long time. Then he closed the journal, his fingers trembling just slightly. Maybe it had been watching both of them all along. Maybe it had always been there. Later, as he drifted into sleep, Max curled beside the bed. Lucas dreamed not of falling, but of standing at a trailhead with sunlight pouring through the trees. The forest hummed around him, alive and patient, and at the edge of the path, half in shadow, half in light, the bear stood once more, not as a threat, not as a savior, but as a quiet presence, as if to say, we walk together now. When Lucas woke, there were tears on his cheeks, not of pain, not of loss, but of something long buried beginning to bloom again. He rose with the sun, strapped on his boots, and stepped out into the morning mist. Not to chase the past, but to walk into the present, where life still waited, unexplained, wild, and full of things worth saving. Morning arrived draped in gold and mist, the sun casting long fingers of light through the forest canopy, touching each dew-drenched branch as if blessing it anew. Lucas stood at the edge of the tree line, his breath curling in the chill, backpack slung over one shoulder, Max trotting beside him with an alertness that mirrored the quiet anticipation in Lucas's chest. It had been 2 months since his rescue, since the bear had emerged from the shadows of death to offer something Lucas still didn't fully understand. And it had been 3 weeks since the woman they rescued was airlifted from the ravine, her name now added to the list of people saved, of reasons why Lucas had returned to this work, not to escape what haunted him, but to step into something larger than himself. He hadn't gone back to the clearing again, not since building the wooden marker with Ethan's name and the words carved beneath. Not all rescuers walk on 2 legs. He didn't need to return there to feel what had changed in him. It was with him now, everywhere. But today wasn't about duty or rescue calls. It was something else. A quiet pull, not unlike the instinct that draws birds back to old nesting places. Lucas had a feeling, not the kind you could explain in words that made sense. Just a quiet knowing in his bones that he was meant to walk a certain path again. He had packed light, a thermos of strong coffee, a few protein bars, a small folding knife, and an old compass that had once belonged to his father. He hadn't touched the compass in years, not since his early hiking trips with Ethan. But today it felt right, something about holding it in his hand, feeling the worn brass edges press against his palm, like a link to something forgotten but waiting. Max patted ahead, ears perked, tails sweeping low as they moved through the early light. Birds called from high branches. A distant woodpecker hammered against bark, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the quiet determination in Lucas's steps. The forest was fully awake now, buzzing with energy, but wrapped in peace. Lucas followed the game trail near the old boundary line where the motion sensor camera had last captured the bear. Not with expectation exactly, just a kind of hope. Hours passed. He walked deeper into the woods than he had since before the storm, moving with ease, His leg no longer a chain, but a quiet companion that reminded him of where he'd been. He paused once to drink from the thermos, watching Max chase a falling leaf with the kind of unburdened joy that only dogs understood. Around them, sunlight slanted through the trees, surmas, dappling the forest floor in shifting gold. And then, as he passed through a narrow cut in the ridge, the air changed. Not temperature, not scent, something deeper, a stillness. Max froze, his ears twitched, his nose lifted to the wind. Lucas stopped too, heart quickening, hand instinctively brushing the handle of his walking stick. Then just beyond the next bend, movement. Not fast, not loud, just the quiet disruption of something large passing between trees. Max didn't bark, he didn't run. He simply turned to Lucas, tail low, and waited. Lucas stepped forward slowly, every part of him alert but not afraid. He rounded the bend and froze. There it was, the bear. Larger than he remembered, its dark coat catching the light, revealing scars along its flank. One leg, the back left, dragged slightly, just as in the footage. But it stood tall, regal even, its eyes fixed on Lucas with the same unnerving, piercing awareness that had haunted and healed him all at once. Time slowed. Lucas didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply, afraid even the sound of his heartbeat might shatter whatever fragile moment this was. The bear didn't approach. It didn't turn away. It simply stood there watching. Max stood beside Lucas now, unmoving, ears folded back. Lucas felt a deep stillness settle inside him, like the space between two waves, when everything hangs suspended. And in that silence, he felt something unspoken pass between them. Gratitude, recognition, farewell. The bear blinked, exhaled a visible breath, and turned. It limped into the woods, disappearing between trees as quietly as it had come. Lucas didn't follow. He didn't need to. He stood there a while, hand resting on Max's head, letting the moment anchor itself in him, becoming part of his story, not as a chapter of strangeness, but of truth. Later, as the sun reached its peak, Lucas found a fallen tree and sat down. He pulled out the compass, opened the lid, and stared at the steady point of the needle. North, unwavering. It reminded him that there would always be direction, even when the map was unclear. That sometimes something or someone would come when all else was lost and offer the way forward. And that perhaps those moments were not miracles, but reminders that we are never as alone as we believe. He took out the small notebook he now carried in his pack, a habit picked up during recovery. Not for journaling exactly, but for remembering things that felt important. He wrote a single sentence: "It saw me, and it chose mercy." He didn't write more. It was enough. The forest remained quiet as he made his way back down the trail, light bending through the trees like a soft hymn. Max trotted beside him, tail wagging slowly, as if satisfied with something resolved. Back at the cabin, Lucas made coffee and sat on the porch with the door open wide. The light faded slowly across the pines, stars beginning to show through the veil of dusk. He didn't reach for a book. He didn't turn on the radio. He just sat, listening. The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment, it sounded like breathing. Later, he stood and walked inside, passing the marker he'd made weeks ago, the one that stood beside the fireplace now, a smaller replica of the one in the forest. He paused, running his fingers over the carved words. Then he whispered something only the walls heard. "You can rest now, Ethan." That night, Lucas dreamed of a trail winding deep into the trees, lit by starlight. And ahead, moving just beyond the edge of sight, a figure walked. Not a bear, not a man, but something in between, something wild, something kind, and he followed. Spring gave way to summer in soft crescendos of birdsong and light, the forest dressing itself in the richest greens it had worn in years, each fern and blossom rising boldly as if defying the quiet hush of the long, frozen months. Lucas Hale sat on the sun-warmed stone outside the ranger station, map unrolled beside him, the back of his hand smudged with graphite from notes he'd been sketching between calls. His shift was nearly over, and the air held that golden softness of late afternoon, the kind that seemed to blur the edges of time. Across the yard, Max lay in the grass, chin on his paws, eyes tracking a drifting butterfly with lazy curiosity. A few feet away, Jessica leaned against the tailgate of the CAR truck, sipping water from a dented canteen, her gaze half distant as she watched hikers come and go from the main trailhead. Busy day, she said, not looking at him. Lucas nodded, folding the map neatly, tucking it under his arm. Clear skies, long weekend. They come out like ants. She smiled faintly. The kind that forget to bring water, shoes, or common sense. He laughed under his breath, rubbing his palm along the wood grain of the staff resting beside him. They keep us relevant. She turned toward him then, her expression softer than it had been in months. You going out tomorrow? Lucas hesitated. Thought I might head back to the clearing. Finish something. She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. Instead, she nodded and took a long sip, eyes squinting against the sun. Take Max. Wouldn't dream of leaving him. That night, Lucas sat on the porch of his cabin with a journal in his lap and the carved compass in his hand. The fireflies had begun to blink through the tall grasses, tiny floating embers of light that made the world feel just a little enchanted. He flipped through the pages he'd filled over the past few weeks. Observations, drawings, moments worth holding on to. And then, near the back, a page marked with a strip of torn red fabric. Beneath it, in rough handwriting, he'd written only 2 words. It mattered. He wasn't sure when he'd written it. Maybe on the day he returned from the ridge and saw the bear disappear into the trees. Maybe it had been one of those truths that simply came through his fingers when he wasn't thinking too hard. But it stayed with him. It echoed. At dawn, Lucas woke early and packed light. The weather promised warmth, and the trails were clear. Max danced at the door, already sensing the purpose of the day, his whole body vibrating with the knowledge of return. Lucas smiled, scratched behind his ears, and they set off together. The hike to the clearing took less time now. His legs still ached in the cooler shade, but it no longer slowed him. He moved like someone who had learned the terrain of his own wounds, stepping carefully, steadily, without apology. When they reached the edge of the glade where the marker stood, Lucas paused. The tree that had pinned him was now rotted and softened by rain, moss crawling up its broken spine like forgiveness. The wooden marker remained, weathered but upright, the carving still legible beneath his hand. Ethan Hale. Not all rescuers walk on 2 legs. He knelt and cleared the brush that had begun to gather at its base. Max wandered the edges of the glade, nose twitching, tail slow and even. The clearing felt different now. Not haunted, not painful, just still. Lucas sat cross-legged in the grass and pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his pack. It was a letter written weeks ago but never left behind. He opened it slowly, the creases soft from handling, and read it aloud, though no one was there to hear. Ethan, if you were here, I think you'd laugh at me for talking to a bear. You always believed animals saw more than we gave them credit for. I think maybe you were right. I think I wanted to believe it, even back then, but I didn't know how. Not until it looked at me and chose not to leave me there. I don't know why it helped me. I don't think I'll ever know. But it did, and you were right. About the forest, about life, about everything. I just wish you didn't have to leave for me to learn it. I hope this marker stands long after I'm gone. I hope someone finds it and wonders what it means. And maybe, just maybe, they'll feel less alone when they do. I miss you, little brother, but I carry you with me now, not in guilt, in gratitude. He folded the letter, slid it into a weatherproof sleeve, and tucked it under the stone at the base of the marker. Max came and sat beside him, silent and steady, and for a while they just listened to the wind. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. Lucas turned his head slowly. It wasn't the bear, not this time. A deer, young, delicate. It blinked at them, unmoving, and then bounded into the woods with a grace that left only silence behind. Still, Lucas smiled. It was enough. The walk back was quiet, sun peeking through the canopy in golden shafts. Lucas found himself humming under his breath, an old song Ethan used to sing on their hikes. He hadn't remembered it in years. But now the words returned like they'd never left, and Mac wagged his tail as if he approved. Back at the cabin, Lucas washed his hands in the stream behind the house and watched the water curl around his fingers. The current moved fast, determined, never looking back. That evening, Jessica stopped by with 2 cups of coffee and a long pause before speaking. You did something out there, she said. I could feel it. Lucas looked at her. I didn't do anything. Exactly, she replied. You let something be. They sat in silence after that, watching the trees shift in the breeze, letting the moment breathe. Weeks passed, the season changed, and in time others came to the forest, hikers, families, volunteers. And some, not knowing why, wandered the long path toward the clearing. And there, in the quiet bend of a broken tree, they found the marker. Some read the words and moved on. Some stood and stared for a while. And some, like Lucas once did, knelt down and placed a hand upon the wood and whispered thanks to something they couldn't name. And always nearby there would be a penny watching, still, gentle. And on the rarest of days, far in the shadows, something else would watch too. A shape among the trees, limping, waiting, never approaching, but present, as if to remind them all that the forest does not forget. And Lucas? He kept walking, kept searching, kept saving. But now he did so not to outrun the past, but to carry it with honor, to speak for those who couldn't, to walk alongside the wild and the wounded, and to remind those he met, lost or found, that not all rescuers arrive with sirens. Some arrive in silence, some on four legs, and some still out of the woods. Mother Bear found a puppy abandoned in the forest. Then the unthinkable happened. The wind howled through the Colorado wilderness, sweeping over the ridges and diving into the hidden folds of the valley where the pine trees stood like sentinels cloaked in white. Snowflakes danced through the air like wandering spirits, and beneath them, the forest lay hushed, heavy with winter's breath. It was in this silence, ancient and sacred, that a single desperate cry broke the stillness, a tiny, wavering whimper, lost, alone and dying. Among the twisted roots of a fallen spruce, half covered in snow, a young German shepherd puppy shivered violently. His small frame, barely past weaning age, was curled into a tight ball, as though trying to disappear into the earth. His short legs trembled, his paw pads cracked and bleeding. The air clawed at his lungs with each breath, and the taste of cold burned his throat. His eyes, watery and wide, searched the tree line without understanding, without hope. He had been warm once. He remembered the feeling of others around him, the soft push and tumble of siblings at his side, the steady beat of his mother's heart. Then came the cold hands of a human, unfamiliar and rough. The journey was short but jarring, a jostling ride in the back of something loud and smelly, followed by the cruel drop into a world he did not know. No mother, no warmth, no shelter. Just trees and wind and the terrible weight of hunger. The pup whimpered again, weaker now. The forest, in all its frozen grandeur, offered no mercy. But somewhere deeper in the trees, something stirred. Massive paws crunched softly over snow. A shadow moved with practiced silence, blending into the dusk beneath the canopy. The bear had smelled the pup long before she saw him. Her sense of smell, keen and ancient, carried the scent of helplessness to her like smoke on the wind. Her thick brown coat was dusted with frost, her eyes deep pools of amber intelligence. She had 3 cubs tucked away in a den not far from here, safe, sleeping, warm. She had once had 4. The memory of the smallest one, lost to the winter months ago, clung to her like a burr beneath her skin. No one grieved her loss but the forest. And now, here, was another small cry, a sound so hauntingly familiar it made her stop. She should have turned away. It was not her kind, not her blood, but instinct, the strange, inexplicable pull that sometimes drives the wild to do the unimaginable, told her to go closer. She approached slowly, her huge body moving with eerie grace, the muscles beneath her fur flowing like shadowed rivers. The puppy did not move. He had no strength to fear her. His body barely rose with breath. The bear lowered her head, nostrils flaring, steam rising from her muzzle. She huffed once, softly, a warm breath over the tiny creature. The puppy whimpered in response. Something inside her shifted. A memory, maybe. The feel of a cub pressing close, the sound of a whimper just before dawn. She had lost one. This one was dying. The forest would not miss it, but she could not ignore it. She nudged the pup once with her nose. He stirred, eyes fluttering. She opened her jaws and, with the most delicate care her massive body could summon, lifted him by the scruff of his neck. The journey to her den was slow. She moved with caution, aware of every step, cradling the small body in her mouth. The snow deepened along the trail, and her fur grew damp, but she pressed forward, driven by something she couldn't name. When she arrived, the three cubs inside the den roused at her scent, stumbling from their sleep with curious grunts and soft sounds. She laid the puppy down between them, and the cubs sniffed him, confused but not hostile. The den was warm, lined with moss and leaves, the air heavy with the musk of her family. The pup stirred faintly, curling instinctively toward the warmth. The bear lay beside them, her great body curved protectively around all four. Days passed. The cubs accepted the stranger quickly, with the simple hearts of children. They lay beside him, licked his ears, nudged him when he whimpered. The bear treated him no differently from the others, grooming his fur, keeping him warm, watching him sleep. But there were limits. The puppy could not nurse. His belly shrank. When she brought fresh meat, he sniffed it but turned away. He whimpered often, too tired to stand. The bear tried again and again to feed him, to care for him, but the line between instinct and biology could not be crossed. She watched as his breaths grew thinner. The cubs lay closer, sensing something wrong. One nuzzled the pup's face. The bear stood at the mouth of the den, staring into the snowfall, torn by a decision no wild creature had ever needed to make. She had saved him once, but now she could not save him again. Not alone. She picked him up one last time. Down the slope, across frozen streams and through groves of aspen and fir, the bear walked with the pup in her jaws. She moved low to the ground, avoiding the trails of humans, staying to the ridges where only the wind and the deer ever passed. The pup dangled limp in her grasp, his eyes closed, his breath a faint ghost. As night fell, the sky opened briefly to reveal stars, distant, cold, and silent witnesses to the impossible. At the forest's edge, the land began to change. Fences appeared, wooden poles with wires. The scent of chimney smoke drifted on the air. The bear hesitated. A dog barked in the distance. Then again, closer this time, not alarmed, curious. From behind a stand of fir trees, the bear watched a porch light flicker on. A man stepped outside, calling for his dog. The bear saw him clearly. Older, gray at the temples, tall and broad in frame, but careful in movement. He held a flashlight. A dog, a big, gentle-looking retriever, trotted beside him, nose to the wind. They moved toward the woods, toward her. The bear laid the puppy gently on the snow, just where the trees began to thin. She stood still, the shadows hiding all but her breath. The dog barked again, this time toward her but not in fear. The man slowed as he approached. He knelt beside the small shape on the ground. His hand reached out, hesitant but kind. When he touched the puppy, his whole expression changed. Gently, he gathered the small body into his arms, wrapping it in his coat. The puppy stirred, faintly, a flicker of life returning. The man looked up, sensing something. Their eyes met. For a moment, just in a moment, the bear held his gaze. He did not move. Nor did she. And in that stillness, a single unspoken understanding passed between them. Then the bear turned and melted into the woods. The man stood, the puppy cradled to his chest. He turned to his dog and murmured, "Let's get him warm, Bruno." The dog wagged its tail and led the way home. Snow continued to fall, soft and silent, as the bear disappeared back into the forest that had always been hers. And behind her, in the wake of winter's cruelty, a miracle had just begun. Edward Harris stood in the doorway of his cabin, the puppy bundled against his chest in an old flannel shirt, his breath billowing in the freezing air like smoke from a forgotten fire. The pup was so still he feared he'd come too late. Bruno, his golden retriever, nudged Edward's leg gently, as if urging him to hurry, and the old ranger didn't need convincing. He stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him, shutting out the cold, the wind, and the weight of the impossible moment he had just witnessed. He moved quickly, his years in the wilderness making his hands steady despite the tremor in his heart. He laid the puppy on a thick wool blanket by the hearth, adding another log to the fire until the flames danced higher, licking at the shadows like golden tongues. The puppy didn't move at first. His breathing was faint, his paws curled tight, but Edward saw the slightest flutter of an ear, and that was all he needed to hope. "You're not gone yet, little one," he murmured. He wrapped the pup snugly in another layer, and fetched a shallow bowl, warming goat's milk he kept for Bruno's sensitive stomach. With a spoon, he dripped a few drops onto the pup's tongue. It took time. But then, a twitch of the tongue, a tiny, weak swallow. Edward exhaled slowly. Bruno lay beside the pup without being asked, his large body radiating warmth. The shepherd stirred slightly, nose bumping into Bruno's fur. That night, Edward barely slept. He dozed in his worn leather chair, listening to the fire crackle, waking every hour to check on the pup, offering drops of milk, whispering encouragement. Dawn crept slowly through the frost-smeared windows, turning the snow outside into a blue glow. The shepherd's breaths had steadied. Bruno lay beside the pup without being asked, his large body radiating warmth. The shepherd stirred slightly, nose bumping into Bruno's fur. That night, Edward barely slept. He dozed in his worn leather chair, listening to the fire crackle, waking every hour to check on the pup, offering drops of milk, whispering encouragement. Dawn crept slowly through the frost-smeared windows, turning the snow outside into a blue glow. The shepherd's breaths had steadied. His eyes opened once, glassy and confused, then closed again. "You made it through the night," Edward said softly. "That counts for something." Over the next week, the pup, now named Ranger, began to heal. He was still fragile, still thin, but his appetite grew, his legs gained strength, and his eyes began to lose their glassy distance. Edward crafted a little bed beside Bruno's, taught Ranger to drink from a bowl, and introduced him to the soft chew of cooked meat. His eyes opened once, glassy and confused, then closed again. "You made it through the night," Edward said softly. "That counts for something." Over the next week, the pup, now named Ranger, began to heal. He was still fragile, still thin, but his appetite grew, his legs gained strength, and his eyes began to lose their glassy distance. Edward crafted a little bed beside Bruno's, taught Ranger to drink from a bowl, and introduced him to the soft chew of cooked meat. He spoke often, telling Ranger about the mountains, the seasons, the names of trees and birds. Not because he expected understanding, but because the silence no longer felt right. "I've lived alone a long time," Edward would say as he refilled the wood box. "Didn't mind it, got used to my own company, but I have to admit, it's good to hear your little paws on the floor." As Ranger grew, so did his curiosity. He spoke often, telling Ranger about the mountains, the seasons, the names of trees and birds. Not because he expected understanding, but because the silence no longer felt right. "I've lived alone a long time," Edward would say as he refilled the wood box. "Didn't mind it, got used to my own company, but I have to admit, it's good to hear your little paws on the floor." As Ranger grew, so did his curiosity. He followed Bruno everywhere, out into the snow to fetch sticks, along the trail to the shed, even beneath Edward's workbench, where shavings from old woodworking projects dusted the floor like fine snow. Edward started calling him the Shadow. Always just underfoot, always watching. But it wasn't just playful energy. Ranger had a stillness to him too, a quiet awareness beyond his age. Sometimes Edward caught him staring out the window toward the forest, ears perked, nose twitching. He followed Bruno everywhere, out into the snow to fetch sticks, along the trail to the shed, even beneath Edward's workbench, where shavings from old woodworking projects dusted the floor like fine snow. Edward started calling him the Shadow. Always just underfoot, always watching. But it wasn't just playful energy. Ranger had a stillness to him too, a quiet awareness beyond his age. Sometimes Edward caught him staring out the window toward the forest, ears perked, nose twitching, as if he remembered something, or someone. Edward never spoke of the bear to anyone. He knew no one would believe him, and even if they did, the story would be twisted, turned into something about a miracle or madness. But he remembered. He would never forget. The way she had looked at him, not like a wild animal, but like a mother making a choice. Winter deepened. The snow stacked high against the cabin walls, and the world outside became a painting of stillness and white silence. Ranger, now sturdy on his legs, darted through snowbanks with Bruno, their breath pluming in the cold like two wild spirits. Edward watched them from the porch, mug in hand, a scarf around his neck, and a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Ranger had become part of him, not just a playground, but a story made flesh, a reminder that the world still held surprises. One morning in mid-February, Edward stepped outside and found Ranger standing at the edge of the woods. Not playing, not sniffing, still alert. Edward called to him, but the pup didn't move. Only when Edward walked up beside him did he see why. Deep in the trees, barely visible, stood the bear. She was larger than he remembered, her coat thicker, her posture calm but watchful. And beside her, two cubs, nearly grown now, their shapes half lost in the tree's shadow. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't move. He only stared. Then his tail gave a single wag, slow and unsure, like a question. The bear blinked. Edward's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't there to harm, nor even to retrieve. It was something else. A checking, a return, a letting go. She gave a low huff, soft like breath over a dandelion, and turned, her cubs following silently behind her. Ranger stayed rooted as they vanished into the woods. Edward put a hand on his head. She remembers, he whispered. So do you. That night, Edward lit the fire earlier than usual, the air sharp with a coming storm. Ranger lay curled beside Bruno, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes wide open, watching the shadows flicker on the cabin walls. In the weeks that followed, Edward began journaling again. He wrote about the bear, about Ranger, about the line between the wild and the tamed. What does it mean, he wrote one evening by lamplight, when a creature of the wild chooses compassion? And what does it mean when a man who thought he had no more room in his life for anyone finds family again in the form of a half-frozen pup? He didn't try to answer it. Some questions were meant to linger. Ranger never lost his alertness around the forest. He would run and chase and wrestle with Bruno, but always kept one ear turned toward the trees, always paused when the wind changed. Edward began to trust it. If Ranger stopped at the edge of the woods and didn't go further, Edward didn't either. Some places, he realized, didn't belong to humans, no matter how long they lived beside them. And some bonds, like that between a bear and a pup, didn't need explanation to be understood. When spring finally broke through the winter's hold, the mountains sighed with green again. Streams gurgled through their icy prisons, and the trees shook off their silence. Edward began to trust it. If Ranger stopped at the edge of the woods and didn't go further, Edward didn't either. Some places, he realized, didn't belong to humans, no matter how long they lived beside them. And some bonds, like that between a bear and a pup, didn't need explanation to be understood. When spring finally broke through the winter's hold, the mountains sighed with green again. Streams gurgled through their icy prisons, and the trees shook off their silence. Ranger had grown tall, his legs strong, his coat thick and glossy. Edward walked with him through the thawed meadow, the sun warm on their backs, the world alive with sound and light. They reached the crest of a hill, and Edward paused to take in the valley below. And there, across the field of wildflowers, at the edge of the distant tree line, she stood again. The bear, lone this time, her cubs nowhere in sight, just her. Still as a statue, Ranger's ears perked. His tail rose and wagged once, then again, a little faster. Edward knelt beside him, resting a hand on his chest. "She's saying goodbye," he said. "Or maybe thank you." Ranger looked up at him, then back to the trees. The bear held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, then turned, disappearing once more into the wilderness that had shaped them both. Edward rose slowly, the warmth of the sun sinking into his bones, and looked down at the pup who had once come from the cold, who had crossed the line between two worlds with nothing but a cry. "Come on, Ranger," he said, voice soft with awe. "Let's go home." Spring seeped into the mountains like a slow-moving stream, tender and patient, unwrapping the land from its long white sleep. The snow melted in rivulets, carving paths through the forest floor, awakening roots, softening the air. Edward could feel it in his joints, in the creak of the wooden porch underfoot, and in the quiet enthusiasm that filled his lungs with every breath. It had been a hard winter, one that had arrived fierce and early and tested every corner of his solitude. But now there was a gentleness in the air. The cabin, once cloaked in silence and storm, was alive with movement. Ranger, now nearly 6 months old, bounded through the clearing with a confidence that bordered on grace. Edward could feel it in his joints, in the creak of the wooden porch underfoot, and in the quiet enthusiasm that filled his lungs with every breath. It had been a hard winter, one that had arrived fierce and early and tested every corner of his solitude. But now there was a gentleness in the air. The cabin, once cloaked in silence and storm, was alive with movement. Ranger, now nearly 6 months old, bounded through the clearing with a confidence that bordered on grace. He had grown fast, tall for his age, his legs long and strong, his coat dark as night with a soft saddle of tan along his back and muzzle. His eyes were a deep, thoughtful brown, eyes that saw more than just squirrels and shadows. He moved with the vitality of youth, but he paused in ways that seemed older than his months, as if listening to echoes that no one else could hear. Bruno trotted behind him, the loyal golden retriever showing signs of age in a slower pace but none in spirit. He had grown fast, tall for his age, his legs long and strong, his coat dark as night with a soft saddle of tan along his back and muzzle. His eyes were a deep, thoughtful brown, eyes that saw more than just squirrels and shadows. He moved with the vitality of youth, but he paused in ways that seemed older than his months, as if listening to echoes that no one else could hear. Bruno trotted behind him, the loyal golden retriever showing signs of age in a slower pace but none in spirit. Edward watched them both from his porch with a mug of coffee in hand, his face softened by a quiet smile. These two, so different in breed and age and origin, had become a pair, inseparable, like brothers bound not by blood but by something deeper. Sometimes Edward marveled at how things had changed. He'd spent years alone in this place, by choice, tucked away from the mess of the world. Edward watched them both from his porch with a mug of coffee in hand, his face softened by a quiet smile. These two, so different in breed and age and origin, had become a pair, inseparable, like brothers bound not by blood but by something deeper. Sometimes Edward marveled at how things had changed. He'd spent years alone in this place, by choice, tucked away from the mess of the world. But now his days were marked by muddy paw prints on the floorboards, tufts of fur caught in corners, the jingle of tags in them, and the thump of tails against his legs. It was a kind of chaos he had not realized he missed until it returned. And yet, for all the warmth, for all the comfort that filled the cabin now, Edward knew there was still something stirring beneath the surface, something that hadn't fully settled. Ranger was restless. But now his days were marked by muddy paw prints on the floorboards, tufts of fur caught in corners, the jingle of tags in them, and the thump of tails against his legs. It was a kind of chaos he had not realized he missed until it returned. And yet, for all the warmth, for all the comfort that filled the cabin now, Edward knew there was still something stirring beneath the surface, something that hadn't fully settled. Ranger was restless. It wasn't in the way he played or in the way he ate. It was in the way he watched the trees. Always the trees. Edward would catch him standing still on the edge of the clearing, ears perked, eyes scanning the tree line as if waiting for someone to step out of it. He wouldn't bark. He wouldn't growl. He would just stare. The same way he had stared the day the bear returned. Edward had seen it before in wild animals. The way deer froze when sensing a distant predator. The way birds tilted their heads before taking flight. But Ranger wasn't afraid. He was remembering. And Edward knew, without being told, that the pup still felt the call of the one who had first saved him. He didn't talk about the bear to anyone. There was no one to tell, but he carried the memory of her in everything he did for Ranger. In every warm meal, in every slow brushing of his fur, in every whispered reassurance by the fire. He was living out the trust she had placed in him that day in the snow. But deep inside, Edward wondered if it was enough. One night, as rain pattered softly on the roof and thunder grumbled in the distance, Edward sat in his chair with a book half open on his lap. Ranger lay curled near the hearth, Bruno snoring gently beside him. The fire cast a warm glow over the room, flickering against the old framed photographs on the walls and the notched walking stick leaning in the corner. Edward had just reached to turn the page when he heard it, a low, sharp whine. He looked up. Ranger was on his feet, ears forward, body tense. The pup walked to the door and sat, tail still, posture straight. Edward stood slowly, setting his book aside. "What is it, boy?" he asked, though in his gut he already knew. He stepped to the door, opened it gently, and let the night air rush in. The rain had eased, but the forest shimmered wet and black. Ranger stepped outside without hesitation. Not in fear, not in panic, but with a sense of purpose. Edward followed, pulling on his coat. Bruno, slower now, lumbered behind them. They crossed the clearing, boots sinking into the soft, rain-slicked earth. Ranger moved toward the trees, then stopped. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Edward, waiting. Together they moved into the woods, not speaking, not needing to. The forest swallowed them whole, damp and whispering, the scent of pine and earth rising like breath from the ground. They walked for 10 minutes, maybe more, following no trail Edward could see, but Ranger moved like he knew exactly where he was going. Then they reached a small glade, a hollow between the trees where the moonlight fell in silver bands through the wet leaves. And there she was, the bear. She stood on the far side of the glade, her coat darker in the rain, her body still, powerful and poised. No cubs this time, just her. Edward stopped. Ranger didn't. He stepped forward, slow but unafraid, his body low in respect, his eyes wide-eyed and watchful. The bear made no sound, no sudden movement. She simply watched him approach. When he stopped a few feet away, she lowered her head slightly, a greeting, or perhaps a farewell. They stood like that for what felt like eternity, good and tame, predator and pup, connected by something deeper than blood or breed. Edward's throat tightened. He knew this wasn't danger. It was a moment, a passing of something sacred. The bear huffed once, her breath misting in the cool air. Then, without looking back, she turned and melted into the trees, vanishing like smoke into the wilderness. Ranger stood still for a long time. They stood like that for what felt like eternity, good and tame, predator and pup, connected by something deeper than blood or breed. Edward's throat tightened. He knew this wasn't danger. It was a moment, a passing of something sacred. The bear huffed once, her breath misting in the cool air. Then, without looking back, she turned and melted into the trees, vanishing like smoke into the wilderness. Ranger stood still for a long time. Then he turned and came back to Edward, brushing against his leg. Edward knelt and wrapped his arms around the pup, burying his face into his damp fur. "She came back," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. She remembered. The walk home was silent, the rain a gentle rhythm overhead. Back at the cabin, Edward dried both dogs with towels and stoked the fire higher. Ranger curled near the flames again, but this time he seemed calmer, more at peace. Edward sat beside him on the rug, resting a hand on his head. "You needed that," he said softly, "and so did I." In the days that followed, Ranger seemed lighter. He played more, slept deeper, and stopped watching the woods with that faraway look. Edward noticed the difference and smiled quietly to himself. Something had come full circle. Spring passed into early summer. The forest grew thick with green, and the air buzzed with insects and birdsong. Ranger, Bruno, and Edward spent their days outside tending the garden, walking the old trails, and napping in the grass beneath the shade of the trees. But Edward never forgot the glade, nor the look in the bear's eyes that night. There had been gratitude there, and something else. Forgiveness, maybe. Trust, the kind of thing that had to be earned, not asked for. And he would spend the rest of his life honoring it. Because in the space between the wild and the tame, between survival and compassion, something extraordinary had bloomed. A bond that had begun with a cry in the snow and had grown into a love that defied everything nature said should be. Summer deepened, wrapping the Colorado wilderness in lush green and golden warmth, the meadows thick with wildflowers, in the air sweet with pine and earth. Life moved in rhythms older than any map. Rivers flowed higher with melted snow, songbirds called from hidden branches, and deer stepped cautiously into open glades at dusk. For Edward Harris, the days felt longer, not in weariness but in fullness. His once quiet cabin now echoed with the sound of paws scrambling across floorboards, the jingling of collars, the bark laugh of Bruno, and the lower, more inquisitive yips of Ranger. It was hard to believe that only months ago, this place had stood cloaked in snow and silence, its hearth burning for one man alone. Now warmth came not just from the fire, but from companionship. Ranger had grown into a striking young dog, muscular, intelligent, his coat sleek with health and his eyes bright with curiosity. He had learned to track deer through the brush without disturbing them, to listen to the shift in bird calls, to read the forest not as a threat, but as a living story written in scent and shadow. Edward marveled at how naturally the pup moved through the trees, as if the wilderness had been his first language and civilization merely an accent he tolerated. And maybe it was. Maybe something of the bear still lived in him, not her strength or her instincts, but the wild grace she had passed on like a breath shared in winter. There were moments, especially in the early morning haze, when Edward would catch Ranger sitting on the hill behind the cabin, his gaze fixed on the horizon, unmoving, as if listening for footsteps in the wind. Edward didn't disturb him in those moments. He understood them. There were memories in silence, things best left unspoken, but never forgotten. The bear had not returned since that quiet meeting in the glade, and perhaps she never would. Perhaps that night had been her last gift, a farewell wrapped in moonlight and mystery. Still, the forest never truly let go. There were signs, a tuft of dark fur snagged on a low branch, claw marks on a pine tree Edward hadn't noticed the day before. Once he found a small clearing with paw prints leading in and out, undisturbed by any human. He said nothing to Ranger, but the pup found it too, and when he did, he sniffed the air, sat for a long while, and then walked away without a sound. Edward took it as a message. She was still out there, watching, trusting, and because of that, he felt a quiet duty to protect the balance that had been forged not by force but by mercy. One evening, just after sunset, Edward sat at the porch steps with a sketchbook in hand, the pages filled with charcoal drawings of the land he loved, the tree that bent like an old man in the wind, the jagged ridgeline of Pike's Hollow, the hidden waterfall that spilled into a sapphire pool. Ranger lay at his feet, panting lightly from the day's hike, while Bruno snored in the corner like thunder far away. A soft breeze stirred the aspen leaves, and Edward found himself thinking about beginnings. Not the ones marked by calendars or clocks, but the kind that sneak up on you. The kind you don't know are happening until you're already living in their aftermath. That winter morning when he'd first seen the bear, how she had laid the pup down and looked into his eyes. That was the beginning, not of a rescue, but of a promise. And now, with summer swelling around them and life so vibrant it ached, Edward felt that promise still beating in his chest. He turned the page in his sketchbook and began to draw something new. Not the trees or the mountains, but a scene he'd held in his heart all these months. The bear in the snow, Ranger lying before her, and himself just a shadow in the clearing. He drew slowly, carefully, the image coming to life with each line, not as a memory, but as a prayer. When he finished, he handed the drawing to Ranger with a chuckle. "What do you think?" he asked. Ranger tilted his head, sniffed it once, then laid a paw gently on the paper as if to say, "This is real. We remember." The following day, Edward and the dogs hiked deeper into the woods than usual. He had a mind to visit the upper lake, a place he hadn't seen since the snow fell. It was a 6-mile trek, winding through groves of spruce and fields of ferns, the elevation climbing steadily until the air turned cool and crisp again. Ranger led most of the way, his nose twitching at every change in the wind, his tail sweeping the grass. Bruno followed slower now, but determined, as if refusing to let age write the final word on his adventures. When they reached the lake, the sun was high and the water glimmered like a bowl of sky. Edward sat on a flat rock, removed his boots, and dipped his feet in, sighing as the cold wrapped around his ankles. Ranger bounded in up to his chest, snapping playfully at the ripples, while Bruno lay on the shore with his head on his paws, watching with patient fondness. It was here, in this bright hush of mountain light, that Edward realized how far they had all come. The boy who had almost died in the snow was now a creature of the wild. The man who had closed his heart to the world had opened it again. Even Bruno, with his silver muzzle and old eyes, had found joy in a pack that gave him new purpose. Edward found himself wondering what would have happened had the bear not intervened. Would Ranger have survived? Would Edward have remained alone? Would the silence of the cabin have grown so loud he couldn't bear it anymore? These thoughts were heavy, but they did not sadden him. Instead, they reminded him how thin the line was between loss and grace, and how sometimes in the space where wild meets human, something sacred can take root. As they made their way back home that evening, the forest sang around them. Crickets, distant owls, the rustle of leaves touched by twilight wind. Ranger walked ahead, his body silhouetted by the last light of day, and Edward couldn't help but feel that he was following something more than a path. He was following a legacy, a silent thread tied not to a leash or a command, but to something older than either of them. Trust born in the heart of winter, carried through the seasons, and now unfolding beneath summer stars. That night, Edward sat by the fire with both dogs curled at his feet. He opened his journal, added a single line beneath his last entry, and read it aloud. What she gave him was not just life, but purpose. And what he gave me was the chance to remember how to love. Then he closed the book, leaned back in his chair, and watched the flames flicker across the room like fireflies drifting through memory. Somewhere beyond the window, the forest watched with quiet approval, and in that moment, nothing felt separate. Man, he, bear, earth, all of it, part of the same great breath, part of the same story. Autumn arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper, slipping into the mountains on cool breaths of wind that rustled golden leaves from the aspen trees and carried the earthy scent of change through the forest. The once vibrant greens of summer had begun to give way to shades of amber, rust, and deep crimson, and Edward Harris found himself watching the transformation with quiet reverence. The mountains had always taught him that nothing stayed still, that time moved in circles rather than straight lines, and this year, more than any before, he understood the truth of it. Ranger had become a fully grown German shepherd now, his body strong and agile, his stride long and fluid like the wind skimming across a field. His eyes held a calm intelligence, a steadiness that mirrored Edward's own, and the way he moved through the world, alert but unafraid, reminded Edward daily that this dog had been shaped by something far greater than his hands alone. Bruno, though slower and more prone to long naps in the sun, still wore the mantle of elder companion proudly, a wise old spirit who had taught Ranger how to be part of a home, how to trust, how to stay rooted even as the forest called. Edward often watched them together, feeling something close to awe settle over him. It was like seeing two halves of a single truth, wild and tame, instinct and loyalty, existing side by side. The days grew shorter, the sunlight slanting lower and warmer in hue, and Edward began preparing the cabin for winter. He restacked firewood beneath the porch roof, cleaned the stovepipe, patched the window frames, and ensured the pantry was stocked with dried goods, canned vegetables, and jars of honey collected in spring. Ranger followed him everywhere, always within reach but never underfoot, his presence a steady heartbeat against the growing quiet. Edward would sometimes catch him gazing into the woods, ears turned towards some distant sound Edward himself could not hear. And though there had been no sign of the bear since that night in the glade months ago, Edward sensed her in the forest still, in the way the birds fell silent at dusk, in the broken branches along a stream, in the deep claw marks etched into a cottonwood tree by the northern ridge. It was a feeling more than a fact, but it never left him. She was out there, and Edward felt her watching, not as a threat, but as a witness. One late October morning, the ground dusted with frost and the air carrying the faintest bite of the coming snow, Edward woke to find Ranger gone. Not unusual in itself, the dog often took early walks with Bruno or roamed the edges of the clearing, but this time Bruno still lay curled at the foot of the bed, snoring softly. Ranger's absence was immediate, like a missing note in a familiar song. Edward dressed quickly, pulling on his boots and coat, and stepped outside into the quiet. The sky was pale and wide, streaked with pinks and silvers, and the clearing was empty. "Ranger?" Edward called, not loudly, just enough to carry. No answer came, only the flutter of birds leaving the trees and the slow drift of mist rising from the forest floor. He waited, heart tightening, then started down the trail they'd walked so many times, his breath visible in the cold morning light. He found the first sign near the edge of the woods, a single paw print in the frost, sharp and sure, heading north. He followed without hesitation, his steps echoing with memories of the winter when this journey had begun. The trail led him over a small rise, through a grove of birches, then across the stream that had narrowed with the cold. He saw more prints there, 2 sets now, side by side, one large, one familiar. His breath caught. He followed them without slowing, heart thudding not from exertion, but from knowing. They led him into a narrow valley where the trees opened into a clearing bathed in morning light, and there, at the far edge, stood Ranger. Not alone. The bear stood beside him. Larger than Edward remembered, her coat full and thick with the coming cold, her presence vast and impossibly gentle. She didn't move when Edward stepped into the clearing. Neither did Ranger, though his ears flicked back briefly, acknowledging Edward's arrival without looking away from the bear. The moment was breathless, not in fear, but in reverence. Edward didn't speak. He simply stood and watched as Ranger stepped closer to her, his body low, respectful, remembering the ancient language passed down in instincts and unspoken truths. She lowered her massive head, and for one impossible instant, she pressed her nose to his. It wasn't a claiming or a goodbye. It was recognition. Ranger stepped back and turned to Edward then, trotting over to his side, pressing against his leg with a calm, steady gaze. The bear remained still, her dark eyes watching both of them, and Edward understood. She had not come for him. She had come to see what had become of the one she'd once chosen to save. And what she saw was enough. With a deep breath that stirred the air like a warm current, the bear turned and vanished into the trees once more. Edward stood there for a long time, one hand resting on Ranger's back, feeling the slow rhythm of the pup's breathing, the pulse of life that had refused to be extinguished. "You were never just a tour," Edward whispered, voice low and steady. "You were always something more." Ranger leaned into him gently, tail wagging once, then twice before he stepped forward, ready to lead the way home. They returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the frost to dew. Bruno greeted them with a sleepy wag of his tail, lifting his head from the rug and thumping it twice before drifting back into slumber. Edward made coffee, filled the bowls with food, and sat by the fire with his journal. He wrote for a long time, not to explain the morning, but to remember it exactly as it was. Unbelievable, yet real. He didn't need the world to understand it. He only needed to honor it. The first snow came 2 weeks later, soft and silent, blanketing the clearing in white and curling smoke from the chimney into the stillness. Ranger lay at the window watching the flakes fall, while Bruno dozed beside the hearth, and Edward sat with a mug in hand, staring into the fire with a heart fuller than he had ever thought possible. In time, Ranger would grow older. Bruno would pass gently into memory. Edward, too, would one day leave the cabin and the forest behind. But the story, the one that began with a cry in the snow and a bear who made a choice no one could explain, that story would live on. In paw prints, in claw marks, in the wind that sometimes felt like a breath from something unseen. It would live in the wild and in the tame, in the spaces where they met, and in the quiet place in Edward's heart where he knew that miracles, no matter how impossible, were real. All they needed was one act of courage, one moment of compassion, and the willingness to believe that nature, for all its harshness, still held the power to surprise us with love.